Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our seminar, How to Milk a Microbe. My name is Jade, and I'm serving as today's moderator for this event. This seminar is a series and the second of our educational seminars that the project is hosting for the Non-GMO project for industry and grocery stores, retailers across the board. As you may know, we're a nonprofit organization, and this series is brought to you in part by the Butterfly Alliance, a group of individual and corporate donors who help fund research, education, and product verification for the Non-GMO project. Before I hand it over to Megan, our host today and executive director of the Non-GMO project, I want to cover a few housekeeping items here. So everyone has entered as a guest today and will be on listen mode only, which means that you'll automatically be muted, but we'd still love to hear from you. So as you can see, the chat icon is available in the panel. If you have any questions for our guest speakers today, please enter them there for our live Q&A session later at the end of the program. You can do this at any point during the presentation. We'll be monitoring the questions, and our staff will be able to respond to questions, as many as we have time for today. So if you're having any technical issues or questions throughout the presentation, you can direct chat me in this panel as well. So all right, and without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Megan.
Thank you, Jade, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really pleased that today we're joined by guest speakers Albert Straus of Straus Family Creamery, Errol Schweizer, author, journalist, and former leader of the National Grocery Program at Whole Foods Market, Alan Lewis, head of government affairs and food and agriculture policy for Natural Grocers, and Linda Cognato, research analyst here at the Non-GMO Project. And we'll be hearing more from each of them quite soon. So to begin, and it's fine if folks want to, if the other panelists want to turn off your video now, and then we'll call you back on. Thank you. So I want to start by acknowledging that I am currently sitting on the ancestral homeland of the Coast Salish people, specifically those we now know as the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe. And I think it's really important that any sincere conversation about food in the United States starts with an acknowledgement that our food system has been built on stolen land and slave labor. And the colonial mindset behind those atrocities is still alive and well. That mindset is based on the misconception that somehow human beings are separate from nature and from each other, and that life is a resource to be extracted and manipulated. And that's the same mindset that's behind all genetic engineering, and it is not going to get us out of the mess that human beings are in as a species in this moment in time on planet Earth. Einstein said that you can't fix a problem with the same consciousness that created it. Fortunately, we are part of nature, and as such, every single one of us has an innate capacity to remember how to belong to the earth, how to be in right relationship with the whole web of life. And it's this instinct for remembering how to respect life and how to respect nature that has driven the success of the Non-GMO Project for more than 15 years. Consumers want products that are natural and are not genetically engineered. And it's becoming more challenging to provide those products. One challenge that we all face is that there is a proliferation of new GMOs that no one is really talking about that aren't being regulated and aren't being labeled. At the Non-GMO Project, we do track these, and again, we'll be hearing today from our lead researcher, Linda, whose team monitors this full time. Today, and if you could pull up the slides, Maddie, be great. Today, we'll be talking about one particular development, new development in genetic engineering, which is Synbio dairy. It being National Dairy Month, we thought the time was right to share what we know and what we think about these new animal-free GMOs that are showing up in ice cream, cream cheese, as fluid milk products, and other kinds of products like snack bars and sports supplements. To be clear, the Non-GMO Project prohibits the use of Synbio dairy in our verification program because it is genetic engineering. Regardless of what the end product may be or what the marketing claims are that are being made, a milk protein created by synthetic biology or precision fermentation cannot be verified by the Non-GMO Project. I do want to acknowledge that many of the companies developing these new GMOs have good intentions that we can all agree on. The need to address agriculture's contributions to climate change and animal welfare concerns. But they don't offer very much transparency in terms of their technologies, their process, and what some of the risks might be. And they don't address the underlying colonial mindset behind genetic engineering. Today, we'll be looking at an overview of what's happening, possible environmental and social risks of Synbio dairy, and the real and proven benefits of traditional organic regenerative dairy created in cooperation with nature. At the Non-GMO Project, we've always been motivated by the effort to empower eaters to make informed decisions. And so I want to start by sharing here's where eaters are at today according to independent market research as it relates to dairy. When shopping, a majority of people are looking for non-GMO dairy milk and yogurt products. Shoppers look for non-GMO milk and yogurt even more than they look for organic or grass-fed. Close to a third of all shoppers always shop for non-GMO dairy milk and yogurt. And then with regard to lab-created foods, nearly half of all North American shoppers view lab-derived meat and dairy proteins negatively. 60% of shoppers doubt lab-derived food can be as safe, healthy, and nutritious as food grown on a farm. Despite these facts, companies are continuing to manufacture and release these new GMO products into the public, again, without labeling or regulation. We're tracking all of this because customers demand transparency in the food system. And so that's why we've pulled together the panel that we have today to shed some light on all of this. And first, I would like to hand it off to our own Linda Cognato, research analyst at the Non-GMO Project. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you, Megan. Welcome, everyone. So I'd like to give you a little bit of context and background in terms of what we're doing to monitor biotechnology at the Non-GMO Project. Here we have, as Megan alluded to, we have a team of researchers, and their full-time job is to monitor GMOs, and that includes both traditional GMOs and what's known in the marketplace today as new GMOs. We have approximately 125 crop, animal, and product categories in the food, agriculture, and wellness sectors. So these are individual items that we are actively monitoring on a regular basis. We have a database of over 500 biotechnology developers that we're actively monitoring. Over 230 of those are companies that are involved in synthetic biology, or as it's called today, often called today, precision fermentation. Approximately 25 of those companies are involved in the development of animal-free dairy proteins. And I might mention that that list is growing every day. So in the marketplace today, Synbio refers to the practice of genetically modifying microorganisms to exploit them for what they do naturally in order to produce or derive novel products. And these microorganisms are often yeast, algae, or bacteria. Although the ability to genetically modify microorganisms is not new, new GMO techniques such as CRISPR and our capabilities overall in terms of understanding genomes have greatly facilitated the process and expanded developer capabilities. And just to reinforce what Megan said earlier, Synbio microorganisms and their derivatives are considered to be GMOs by the Non-GMO Project standard, even though they, for example, may not require labeling under the National Bioengineered Food Standard Law. And we are now seeing a shift in terminology away from Synbio to precision fermentation. So just some key facts to share with you. The global Synbio agriculture and food market is projected to grow to 14.12 billion by 2025. 2021 recorded a significant increase in investment in alternative protein development, a total of 5 billion, marking a 60% increase over 2020. And this includes cell cultured, Synbio, and plant-based alternative protein. According to a recent report by the FAIR Initiative, fermentation startups reeled in more than 1.4 billion in 2021. And as you might know or imagine, funding sources include accelerators, incubators, venture capitalists, and the mega wealthy. So just to give you a brief timeline of the history of the development of genetically modified microorganisms, in 1990, genetically engineered chymosin was introduced to the marketplace. Then in 2014, Evolva released a Synbio vanillin, which was branded Always Vanilla. In 2014, both Perfect Day, which was originally called Mufree, and the Every Company, which was originally called Clara Foods, they were both founded with support from New Harvest. In 2016, the Impossible Burger and its Synbio ingredient leg hemoglobin, or heme, was launched. And in 2019, Perfect Day launched its first product, which was an ice cream. I want to give you a little bit of an update in terms of where we're seeing animal-free dairy in the marketplace. As Megan mentioned, new products are in several dairy categories, including milk, ice cream, and cream cheese. They're also making their debut in other products, such as protein powder, baked goods, cake mixes, and chocolate bars. And more animal-free dairy proteins are on the horizon. There are several developers working specifically on cheese, including, for example, mozzarella. And those products are due to be released within the next couple of years. This is a partial list of animal-free dairy proteins, and this includes brands, specific companies that are embracing this technology, and then also developers. And these are things that are in the marketplace now or will soon be in the marketplace. And just want to review some of the marketing claims. And this is a partial list. Their claims are that they're more sustainable, they're essential to saving the planet. These proteins are better and products are better for your health. They are non-GMO, they are vegan and kosher, they're generally recognized as safe. And these are some of the marketing claims that we will be addressing later in this presentation.
Thank you, Linda. Next, I'd like to introduce Alan Lewis. Alan navigates government affairs and food and agriculture policy for Natural Grocers, an old family-run health food chain founded in 1955, operating 170 stores across 21 states. Alan advises dozens of natural product and ag tech startups across the country as part of his effort to reinvigorate local and rural food systems. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you, Megan. Winston Churchill described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And I pulled that quote out because it's so apt for the Synbio industry. There are untold thousands of labs working to monetize these technologies that science has discovered, and they're each trying to develop unique methods and processes and layered methods and processes so that they can protect that intellectual property and claim exclusive use of it. So I'm just going to go over how patents and investor disclosures work and what we can glean from them to solve this puzzle, what the companies like to say and what they don't want to discuss, the environmental safety and health and ethics of these technologies, and then questions for listeners to ask these companies afterwards. Next slide, please. So patents and investor disclosures. Patents are interesting because patent applications contain every possible manifestation of a technology, the materials, the processes, the results, in order to try to have first right to use that exclusively or to license it exclusively. The investor disclosures, however, those are required to be given to investors if you're doing any significant financial deal. But the number of publicly traded synthetic biology companies is a handful. Almost all of these labs developing this technology are private, and they're funded by private investors. So those investors get a set of disclosures about the technology and the risks associated with them, but that never trickles down to the shoppers. So the broad span of patents we're looking at for dairy protein, they're editing fungus and bacteria to produce woolly mammoth milk protein that's fed a sugar nutrient solution. Now, I put an asterisk on mammoth because remember how those patents work. They have literally said we can use lion milk, opossum milk, rabbit milk, human milk, it doesn't matter, and they list woolly mammoth milk as a potential exclusive dairy protein that they're going to produce. In addition, that's just a singular protein. In order to create a viable dairy ingredient, there's a mass of artificial flavors, oils, sugars, processed ingredients that have to be added to that to create the marketable product or ingredient that appeals to consumers. On the Synbio animal patents, it's even more crazy, I guess is the best way to put it. Lots of gene-edited pathogens, including E. coli, Listeria, SARS-CoV, all of this. And it's not just to make a heme or to make, it's all of the other flavors, textures, aromas, and everything. It's multiple processes. And of course, there's animal cell mutation that we will cover in another presentation later in the year. So next slide, please. So what are the investor risk factor disclosures? Well, this is an example from Ginkgo Bioworks, which has some subsidiaries making meat, including Meatly. The genetically engineered organism and materials that we developed may have significantly altered characteristics compared to those found in the wild, and the full effects of deployment or release, intentional or otherwise, may be unknown. This is what investors are saying so that they know that that $4 billion going into the industry may not come back to them. Next slide, please. So what do companies like to talk about? We took this off Perfect Day's website today. Animal-free protein from flora that makes their products kinder and greener while leaving the Earth's resources alone. Well, behind all of this technology is a whole supply chain and a whole political economy that Errol Schweizer is going to review. But we're talking about an industry that's fundamentally dependent on petrochemical, chemical-intensive GMO agriculture. That's dependent on energy and agricultural subsidies. Most of these flora, which is a beautiful word, include bacteria and fungi, but the pathogenic ones, because pathogenic ones mutate quickly and reproduce quickly, which is what's needed to commercialize these technologies. Especially in the meat area, they're turning off growth regulating genes. Lots of multiple steps of genetic manipulations in different ways that add up to the final metabolite that's being released. So what are the sources of this feedstock? How is it processed? After all this is said and done, it results in biohazard waste that has to be processed, has to be removed. There's also an untold number of entourage materials, metabolites, proteins, prions that travel with this process and are not completely removed. There's microfiltration and centrifuges and whatnot, but in the end, no one is testing for all of the unknown and known substances that are in the finished product. Next slide. So how do you approach it as a shopper thinking of GMO and flora and all of these environmental claims and how lovely it will be to have non-animal protein? Well, what are those novel proteins, prions, and organisms that are in that product? We need to ask these manufacturers and ask for the science. And if they haven't done the science, then they need to press the pause button and do it. These things can remain in the finished product. So we really need to pay attention if someone's eating this stuff to what the downstream consequences might be. No detectable GMOs. Well, great. You've moved the detectable GMOs down to a few parts per million or 10 parts per million. But the environmental damage that went into that supply chain and results in the waste, that has always been the problem with GMOs. And so yet again, we have an entire industry dodging the question. Stay aware of allergic reactions and disruptions to the gut microbiome. This is where our bodies engage with the environment and all of the ingredients in our food. There is no science on this about how novel materials generated by these processes affect the body. And, yeah, thank you. So keep asking these questions. What level of biosecurity does your factory have? Why does a food factory have to have level 4 biosecurity? What are you doing to these microbes, to these pathogens that is so dangerous that the potential of them being leaked it requires multi-million-dollar investments in security, heavy regulation on announcing and reporting potential problems and potential release problems. And are you genetic engineering? Are you gene editing? Are you inducing mutation? There are a lot of ways to induce mutation that still qualify as creating a novel food ingredient that raises a lot of questions that are not being asked or answered. And what organisms? Is it the Listeria? Is it the COVID SARS? Is it the E. coli? Is it a fungi? Are these pathogenic molds that are being used? And how much ends up? So the fermentation and growth feedstocks, the people that I talk to in these industries, as Megan said, they're kind, they're smart, they have all the best intentions. Their business doesn't start at their receiving dock where they get a 2,000 gallon tank of high fructose corn syrup that gets highly processed into a nutrition solution. Where are those feedstocks grown? What are the upstream consequences of those feedstocks? If you don't support GMO agriculture, it's very difficult to support precision fermentation, alt meats, and synthetic dairy proteins because they completely depend on it. So what were those novel materials, as I mentioned? And how are you really removing the impurities, waste, and adulterants? The microfilters might go to 95%, but 5% of 1,000 gallons of spent ferment ending up in a finished product can be a lot. And how do you dispose of that hazardous waste? Often it has to be incinerated, and then they can claim that it's compostable, but that in and of itself represents a whole set of problems. So I'm going to end with this question. Will you provide me, the shopper, the same risk disclosures that you are required by law to give investors? Because that's what I really need to know to make food choices. I would choose to go with Straus, Albert Straus's dairy, over any of these synthetic protein ingredients. Back to you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Alan. And remember, everyone, if you have questions for any of our speakers today, please submit them in the chat for our live Q&A at the end. Next, I would like to introduce Errol Schweizer. Errol is a retail consultant and board member, a regular Forbes contributor, and former VP of the National Grocery Program at Whole Foods Market, where he was responsible for $5 billion in annual sales across 75 product categories and helped many innovative new companies become household names. Welcome, Errol.
Thanks, Megan. I'm just really appreciative of the Non-GMO Project for hosting this. Want to give a special appreciation to Linda Cognato and her team, as well as Alan Lewis for doing so much to educate me about these. And just appreciate everybody who's attending, industry folks, as well as folks from the Synbio GMO industry who are also curious and willing to engage in this dialogue. So I'm going to talk a little big picture stuff. We need to sort of roll back the clock here. We're going to talk a little bit about the GMOs that have been in the food system, have been in the industry now for 25 plus years. And there were promises made when this stuff was being launched back in the 90s. It'll feed the planet, it'll grow more food, reduce chemical usage, reduce work for farmers. Yet the results are definitely a mixed bag. For sure, there's lots of cheap, highly processed food derived from subsidized commodity crops, although a lot of that's gotten more expensive in the current inflationary environment. GMO grains are primarily used for ethanol, animal feed processing ingredients, and distillers grain, right? GMOs fit lock and key into industrial food systems based on large-scale land ownership, settler colonialism. There's over 200 million acres of GMO cultivation for those purposes, 90+% of corn, soy, canola, sugar beets, cotton. There's increased chemical usage on farms, and there's residues present in food, which have actually been linked with cancer. There's been some pretty big lawsuits about that. Increased pest and weed resistance, hunger and food insecurity have increased, in particular in the current COVID-19 era. GMOs are in more than 75% of processed foods. So even though Non-GMO Project and our certification has some market visibility, the vast majority of foods do have GMOs. There's extreme concentration in ownership of seed and agrochemicals, reliance on industrial monocultures, and the labor savings has been at best a mixed result for farmers. Next slide, please. So what are the promises that we're hearing now? And I think this is really important, especially for the folks in the Synbio industry, to consider the promises and to consider the context of why folks are perhaps questioning or a bit skeptical. So the main promises are about mitigating the agricultural impact on climate change. Conventional meat and dairy are approximately 30% of global greenhouse emissions. I just wrote a recent article, 2 recent articles about the meat industry. Totally on board with critiquing the conventional meat industry, folks. There's less externalities in these new GMOs and precision fermentation cultured meats in the current production paradigm, but that's a low bar. Reducing animal suffering and the need for CAFOs, totally on board. We have to eliminate CAFOs. In fact, Heal Food Alliance is doing a webinar about eliminating CAFOs. So the food justice movement is also on board. So better jobs with more technical skills than meat packing. We'll get back to that later. Technology is heavily marketed to vegan, vegan adjacent, flexitarian consumers, meeting the demands for ethically produced foods, appealing to tech savvy millennials, Gen Z, younger folks, and applying the disruptive consumer focus Silicon Valley model to the food system. So broader industry context, you're coming into a food system now with, let's just say meat and poultry. Next slide, please. 200 million in annual sales, 500,000 workers, yet 85% of processing is controlled by a handful of companies, Tyson, JBS, Smithfield, Seaboard. Some of these same companies like JBS, Tyson, et cetera, have all made significant investments in food tech, including brand and product acquisitions and product development pipelines. Inside a food industry, inside a food sector where white people own 98% of the agricultural land, make up 84% of food execs, and 70% of investors. And the grocery industry itself, consolidation. 4 or few companies control 90+% of soda, mayonnaise, 80+% of chocolate, 75% of yogurt, 70+% of breakfast cereals, etc. And just 6 retailers control over 50% of grocery sales. Next slide, please. This is a great graphic from Phil Howard on some of the ownership and investments. And even though these companies, these newer companies, position themselves as an alternative, they're taking money, they're getting minority ownership stakes from the incumbents, particularly in the meat and processing industries. Next slide. So following the money in IP, a lot of funding from tech oligarchs, and I use the word oligarchs seriously. It's not just Russians that are oligarchs. We have American oligarchs too. So Mark Andreessen, Peter Thiel, Vinod Khosla, Google Ventures, Bill Gates. And reason why I bring up Bill Gates, made his fortune by enclosing, privatizing, and monopolizing what has essentially been a public resource, a common pool resource, AKA software. which is now known as Microsoft. The tech investor model identifies a particular market sector or category and its sales potential, funds the company to offset large losses, a la Uber or Amazon, and then competing aggressively with the goal of cornering the market as a monopoly or maybe a duopoly, like you have Uber or you have Lyft. The investor is throwing billions of dollars at such enterprises. They have fiduciary duty to their shareholders to generate high returns. They're betting on the potentially enormous upside in the enclosure and market domination of commodity groups and categories. So it's important not just for the general public to understand this, but the entrepreneurs and scientists who are doing this research with the best intentions, that once you're entering capitalism, you have to play by those rules and you don't set those rules. So who owns these patents? Who owns these intellectual properties? And on what? The organisms, processes, techniques, final products? What are the social and environmental externalities behind the IP, such as what Alan has talked about? And what are the implications for a single company to own the formula for milk, honey, eggs? And we're already seeing it with Impossible, where they actually just launched a second lawsuit today suing a competitor. They had a previous lawsuit against one of their other competitors for various reasons. And they filed over 14 patents for their product. It's essentially a software burger. Next slide. Social equity considerations. Things to think about in the broader context in a incredibly unjust and exploitative food system. 75% of grocery clerks are food insecure, yet we're talking about this next level food tech. So what type of social equity models are being built in the supply chains and org structures of these companies? How diverse are the leadership teams and cap tables? Who's going to make profit on it? Who owns, governs, and makes decisions in the companies? Are any pursuing B Corp, open book management, true cost accounting, considering alternate ownership models such as ESOPs, worker cooperatives? These are not usually encouraged by VCs. When you consider that 75% of food retail workers experience food insecurity and hundreds die from COVID-19, what changes will this technology bring to a food workforce that has tremendous turnover, low morale, and growing sense of injustice? Hence why you're seeing strikes and union campaigns. Will the technology be open source and available to the public, a la Linux, as opposed to Microsoft? What will the licensing and royalty agreements entail? Just curious, guys. Will independent third-party researchers be allowed to reproduce and validate the scientific claims? And a lot of that goes back to, will the technology be open source and available? And then finally, thinking beyond the promises, thinking about food sovereignty and community democratic control of food systems. One way to think about this is what Julie Guthman and Charlotte Biltikoff talk about: magical and secrecy to drive innovation, capture market share. On the one hand, technologies intend to replace or compete with the brutality of CAFOs. Nobody disagrees with that in this room, I'm sure. And the resulting greenhouse pollution, which all of us want to eliminate. But they're also bound by IP that create tremendous upside value for founders and investors while clouding potential externalities. Number two, this is about the workforce, demanding a just transition for meat and poultry industry workers, over 500,000. They can be displaced by new technologies. Just transition strategies have been developed by labor unions and environmental justice groups in frontline communities who saw the need to phase out these industries that were harming workers, community health, and the planet, while at the same time provide opportunities for workers to transition to other jobs. Applying the precautionary principle. This is a bit controversial because it essentially extends the Hippocratic Oath, i.e. do no harm, beyond the individual to the community, the planet, and to institutions. This is something for governments and corporations and NGOs. Do you have a precautionary principle in place? And be wary of profit models, of business models that concentrate ownership, power, and profits. And then finally, I'll just say, healthy fresh food should be a human right, and it's our responsibility to make sure everybody has access to it. Thank you, folks.
Thank you so much, Errol. Next, I'd like to introduce Albert Straus. Albert is the founder and CEO of Straus Family Creamery and Straus Dairy Farm. Albert's farm is the first certified organic farm west of the Mississippi River, and Straus Creamery is the first 100% certified organic creamery in the country and the first creamery in North America to be Non-GMO Project verified. Albert has been a leader in sustainable organic farming for decades, advocating for family farms, true cost of production, and climate positive dairy practices. Over to you, Albert.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. I think you said everything I was going to say. So in the the history of my farm and my business is that in an environment where we have 4.6 million dairy farms in 1940 and now today have less than 30,000 dairy farms in the United States, it's a very hard business to survive in. And so I end up changing our model, becoming the first certified organic dairy and creamery west of the Mississippi River in the beginning of 1994, and the first 100% organic creamery in the United States. Since then, we have 12 dairies supplying our creamery in Sonoma County, and 85% of the dairies in these two counties are certified organic. And our mission is to sustain family farms in Sonoma County by providing high quality organic dairy products and help revitalize rural communities through education and advocacy everywhere. And my vision is to create an economically viable organic dairy farm model that's good for the planet and our communities while providing high quality food locally and regionally. So 3.5 years ago, I gave a goal to my sustainability director to be carbon neutral on my farm by the end of, well, originally it was going to be end of last year, and now it's going to be the end of next year, and expand that model to the other farms that supplies by 2030. It's based off four parts. One is we were the first dairy in the United States to have a carbon farm plan, regenerative farming, where you're adding compost to the land, using animals to intentional rotational graze, and pulling carbon from the atmosphere and putting it back in the soil through growing more of the grasses and more of the crops. And it's been recognized internationally as one of the only ways to reverse climate change rather than reduce it. And my belief is that livestock have an essential role in reversing climate change. Second part is we've had a methane digester on our farm for the last 18 years. So the manure that we capture from when they're being fed or milked is contained in a lagoon, and we have a plastic cover over it, and the methane that's generated by that anaerobic condition is captured and used as a fuel to generate all the electricity for the farm. And last year, we collaborated with BMW to take advantage of the low carbon fuel standard in California that incentivizes renewable electricity in the pathway to electric vehicles. So we're selling carbon credits on the market and creating an income source for farmers, an alternative income source. Third thing is last year, we became the first dairy in the United States, the first commercial trial for feeding red seaweed to cows to reduce their enteric methane, which is the belches, not the parts, from cows, by up to 95%. So by feeding a 1/4 pound in a 45-pound diet, that's the results you can get. And so we have now approval from state of California to start feeding it, and they're starting to grow it in Hawaii, so that we will have that by the second half of next year. And the last part is that 5 years ago, I put together a fully electric truck to feed the cows that's powered by the cow's waste, and we also converted an electric loader, a John Deere loader, to a fully electric this last year. And it's all based on this organic farming system that the USDA Organic we feel is the gold standard, that all these tenants of other claims are talking about one aspect of what certified organic means, from animal welfare to non-GMO to regenerative. They're all part of what certified organic means, and so it's part of the whole farming system. And excuse me. And then can you change the slide, or change the slide? I think it is, please. No, it's back to, please. One more. There it is. So by the end of next year, my dairy will have a equal or lower carbon footprint than any plant-based dairy alternatives. So if you look at the chart, the red bar is ours, the dairy industry is on the left, and the alternatives are the other ones on the chart. So I feel very optimistic that dairy farming is something that can really be a positive impact on our environment and our communities. The other aspect is dairy products are essential to feeding world hunger according to the World Food Bank and the UN, and that these alternatives don't have the nutritional density or the positive impact on the environment that they project. So with that, I'll just kind of stop there and wait for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Albert. Your farm and your work is such an inspiration, just incredible. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today and welcome you to come back on, Linda, Alan, Errol, and Albert. We're so glad you're able to join us in our discussion on how these Synbio dairy products are entering the market without shoppers' awareness. And so now we're going to transition to our live Q&A portion of the seminar, and I think we have some great questions coming in for our speakers.
Excellent. Thank you, Megan. All right. Yep, we have some questions here. Thank you all for your lovely presentations and for rejoining us. All right. If anyone else has questions, feel free to please enter them now for our guest speakers. And we will go ahead and get started here. All right. We have a question here. Who is regulating these new dairy products? Aren't they required to be labeled by the US government? Would like to take that question.
Alan, you're regulatory. Why don't you go for it?
So in most cases, the company itself compiles a safety dossier and some research, presents that to the FDA and says, we think our products are safe. But that's why I pointed out that what's in those products is often unknown or undetermined. So how you can say they're safe is a big question. We saw that with GMOs. The big false question was, is GMO food safe? No, the big question is glyphosate safe? And now that we understand the human microbiome, we know that glyphosate is this horrendous, pervasive, persistent contaminant that's causing a lot of chronic disease, including cancer. So that's one regulatory path, is the company presents a case that its products or its ingredient is safe. The other part of the regulation, which doesn't like to get talked about, is the requirements for operating a biohazardous or biosecure lab, level 1, 2, 3, 4. A lot of these have to be at the top level. It's not very well regulated, and it's a bunch of reporting and very little action. The number of actions based on Frankenstein products that have, or materials that have been released in the environment accidentally or intentionally, there's almost never any enforcement, but there is a requirement for reporting. Those are the two things that come to mind. These are just foods, just being called safe, and the FDA lets them run through completely. The last thing would be the labeling, and clearly the synthetic biology people, we knew this at the time, drafted the language in the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Act so that they do not have to disclose that they're using bioengineering. So there's a regulation in place that actually is unregulation. In other words, everyone can fly under the radar using these technologies.
And I think that comes, I know that comes as such a surprise to most eaters, and that was the case with traditional GMOs also, just the assumption that, of course, if something is for sale in a grocery store, it must have been assessed for safety, like we must know something about it. And traditional GMOs were only regulated through a pretty narrow law under the Plant Pest Act, which doesn't apply to things that aren't crops. So there really isn't a regulatory framework for requiring assessment of these things. And that's where the consumer demand for transparency really comes up against what the actual practices are. It just, the transparency isn't there. So
like with our GMO problem in general, the real enforcement will be class action lawsuits. It'll be consumers saying, this isn't natural, this contains things you're not disclosing, this caused me harm, and you didn't know it was going to. That's going to be the, the real guardrails for the industry.
Thank you both. This question is for Albert. What threats does your dairy face from precision fermentation derived dairy?
Excuse me, from what kind of dairy?
From precision fermentation dairy.
Like bio.
What kind of threats?
Well, for one thing, I think what we're trying to do is create a farm and farming system that's economically viable. And when you have competition that is talking about and projecting that dairy is not good for you, not good for the planet, it creates this adversarial relationship in the marketplace and in the public that is not healthy, and it's very damaging to farmers who do their best to produce high quality food that is environmentally beneficial. So the technology itself, I feel that they're not really equal to the quality, it's not from the earth, it's not natural, it's not, and it's taking shelf space that is not competing against conventional dairy products. It's competing against organic ones because they're at a price point that is not going to take conventional consumers. It's taken away from organic dairy consumers that are now shown that they're eating consuming plant-based and organic, and splitting their dollars. So I feel that and the other part of it, what the biggest damage is that we've lost our farms and our rural communities. And so for the answer I've gotten from cell-based products companies is that, farmers can always work in labs. So you're taking people off the farms, out of the communities, and we're destroying our local communities, which we've lost a lot of our rural communities around the country. My community is non-existent. There's only 30% of the houses are actually lived in by full-time residents, and no one can work and live in our communities. It's too expensive. So we have a hard time finding employees. We have a hard time, continuing what we do and having a vibrant community that we live in and work in. And so I think that's something that's really this direction and this type of products take away from our farms, our communities, and our the way we want to live, and our health. As in my firm belief is, it's not as healthy.
Hey, Megan, can I jump in? I want to add to that.
Please.
I've worked with plant-based dairy companies, and I've also been on the board of a processor that process both plant-based and actual milk dairy. So I'm kind of familiar with the dairy industry economics. And I think the first thing for the technologist to understand is if your price point on shelf is being subsidized by investor dollars because you're able to run the company in the red, you automatically have a leg up on organic regenerative dairy farmers who are trying to run a profitable business. Now, the main, the big conventional dairy industry, if we factor in true cost accounting, look that up if you don't know what it means, for government subsidies and externalities for, pollution, environmental, water. Likewise, much of their price point on shelf, which is usually cheaper than what Albert is selling for, is also, they're able to essentially run in the red too. I'm not saying that they have an easy job, I'm not saying that Albert has an easy job, and I'm not saying that precision fermentation is an easy process. I'm actually a biologist. I mean, it's hard to work in a lab. I raised my daughter to be a biologist too. But you have to think about why Uber and Lyft are able to compete with taxi cabs, because they're able to offset their losses and their expenditures through investor dollars. So just keep that in mind when you're setting up a price point. And also just want to say that having done retail surveys, this stuff is being sold for a premium and is being marketed more upmarket, is being marketed towards opposed to doing what you say it's going to do, which is you say you want this to compete with Dairy Pure, you want this to compete with Fairlife. Well, it's being marketed upstream to higher, more premium categories at this point. Thank you.
I can add one more piece to that. our model of supporting a collaborative between the processor and dairy is different than almost everybody in this country. We instead of twice a month, we're required to pay for the milk from the farms as a creamery, and we hand deliver that check rather than mailing or direct depositing. So we create a relationship with the farmer and an understanding what farming is about with our management at the creamery. And then 4 times a year, we get together with all the farms, talk about how the creamery is doing, and ultimately agree the issues and the kind of the challenges and opportunities on farms, but ultimately agree to addendum to our contract that has a volume of milk that's in line with our sales. So we're able to support, we don't have extra milk that we have to sell out of a loss, and we're able to support a price to our farmers that's normally 10 to 15% higher than any of our competitors. So we're trying to make an economically viable system by really managing and collaborating with the farmers.
Thank you. All right, here's another question. As a buyer, how can I watch out for these new GMO products to ensure that I'm not purchasing them for customers? How would I recognize them?
Look for the butterfly.
Thanks, Alan. I was hoping someone else would say it, but truly, the Non-GMO Project is the only entity, certainly the only certification organization that is comprehensively tracking all of these ingredients and prohibiting them in our verification program. So it's very complicated, as Linda said. We've got, and Linda, feel free to chime in here. She and her team are currently monitoring more than 500 companies, and they all make however many products and ingredients. So if you think about the challenges with the first generation of GMOs and all of the little ingredients that can be made out of corn and soy and how difficult it is as a buyer, I started working on this project as from the retail angle. I was working at the food co-op in Tucson, just trying to provide non-GMO choices to our shoppers who are looking for that. So I started out with looking at ingredient panels, trying to determine whether or not something contains GMOs. It's very difficult. That's why we started this organization, is to make it easy and more transparent for shoppers and for retailers to know when something is non-GMO. And also we do have, and yeah, I don't know, Linda, if you want to add anything, but just keep tracking our education materials too. We do new GMO alerts to raise awareness about ingredients and products. So we do provide educational information on an ongoing basis to help inform you too. But with your role as a buyer, really looking for non-GMO project verification is the easiest way. And that's why we're here and what we do. Linda, do you want to add anything?
Sure, Megan, and thanks for that. I think that in addition to having difficulty identifying these ingredients and inputs on product labels or ingredient panels, I also think it's interesting to note that NBFDS, which is the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard that supposedly alerts us to the presence of these ingredients in products, really falls short in that regard, because if there's no detectable DNA in the final product, then those products are not required to be listed on pack. And so that not only includes derivatives of synthetic biology, but it also includes other derivatives. So for example, if you have cornstarch in your product that is derived from genetically modified corn, because there's no detectable DNA left in the final cornstarch, you would not be required to list it under NBFDS. So there are a number of ways in which NBFDS falls short in terms of alerting to consumers for where these inputs and ingredients are present in products.
And I'll just add, USDA Organic prohibits these practices, and likewise, Rodale's Regenerative Organic certification, as well as the Demeter Biodynamic Standard, prohibit these practices as well.
Excellent, thank you. All right, I think we will call that a wrap. Thank you so much to all of our speakers today. Really appreciate your attendance and your time here. And all of the questions as well. There were some wonderful questions that we weren't able to get to that I wish we had time for, but thank you to all of our listeners today for submitting those questions and for participating. We are So in closing, we would just like to thank the Butterfly Alliance and our donors for supporting this work. And if you want to learn more about the Butterfly Alliance, you can find it on our website. It's also still Dairy Month. So if you'd like to join our campaign or learn more about Dairy Month and Synbio, you can find us on our website as well under New GMOs. And if you are a brand that's interested in getting verified, please find us at Get Verified on our website as well. So thank you so much, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to all the attendees for your attention and time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.